Hi everybody. So this is our second critique for milestone 1, and in this particular assignment what you were doing is in a way quite similar to what we previously worked on in task 1, where we're really starting to just be aware of positive and negative space. Um, the difference with this one on a technical or criteria level is that now you can use as many shapes as you want. You can also change the size of the shapes. But the sort of the same principle is in place, that we're starting to really consider what negative spaces do in a design. As I would say, somebody who's not aware of design principles or hasn't really um, thought a lot about design tends to see negative or the positive spaces only. Whatever those positive spaces, it doesn't matter if they're white or black, it just depends on how they look. Like here we see these are positive spaces, and here we see the white is negative space or is positive spaces. So it doesn't really matter what color it is. It's just how the eye perceives what is a positive space. If like you take a camera and you're photographing, let's say you're taking a portrait, just a picture of somebody. The person is the positive space, but all of the space around them is also really important, that negative space. And as you develop your eye as an artist or a designer, you start really noticing that negative space. And that's why you see, you've probably done this yourself. When you've taken a photograph, you've kind of moved your, the frame. This is the frame right here, around our design. You've kind of moved it around so that you get that positive space exactly where you want it, where it makes sense, so the negative space arranges around it in a really interesting way as well. You can see next time you take a picture with your camera, even just a snapshot, notice how you start to do that. And the more, I think, just the more comfortable you get with working with composition, the more you don't even think whether it's positive or negative. You just start wanting to create a nice composition. The other thing we're doing with this particular assignment is, well, no, actually, I think I've covered it all. Pulling things off the edge of the space of the page. Oh, maybe I haven't mentioned that. Yeah, so pulling things off the edge of the page. Back to that camera example, oftentimes, you might crop your design where, not all of your positive space is within the frame, and you do that for a lot of reasons. It just creates a more interesting composition. It allows you to design your space a little bit more, refined way. It opens the space up. It sort of allows the eye to kind of maybe move off of the space, kind of imagine what's behind, to the sides. It really creates a more interesting space. So that's one of the things we're thinking about in this assignment, is pulling things, cropping things off. A lot of times when people start in design, they want to put everything in the middle, in the center, or kind of, they look at the frame here as being a boundary that they can't cross. But crossing that boundary is oftentimes where things can get very interesting. So we'll take a look at that too, and make sure that everybody is um, working with the edges of that plane. Okay, Jamie, let's see what you said here. Overlapping the images was the most tedious part. It really is. Yes, I can understand that. Um, and you created sections of patterns. Good, yeah. So I think that one of the nice things about what we're doing is, everybody is probably a little bit at a different level in terms of the software, Illustrator or Photoshop, whichever you're using. And these actually are really good exercises just for learning some of the basics, like moving things around, ordering things, resizing, rotating, those things that you never leave behind in terms of what you do in a software. So I really like them for that part. And I really liked what you did here with the sections of patterns. That's actually a very good strategy for developing a design, is repeating things. So you've got like this little section here that are lines, and then you've got some circles, and then this kind of pattern that you've built. It's like what you've been doing here is sort of building little structures and putting shape, kind of, it's almost like Lego, putting things together. And Lego's, I think, popular for a reason, is that it really is a kind of a way that we create structures, which we do in design as well. It is a form of design. So yeah, this looks really good. And I think the other reason that I think it's working really well is it fits the idea of what we're trying to work with here, is that we're pulling things off the edge of the page, and you've used all 4 sides here, which is great. Might as well. And also the idea of breaking up the background the negative space in the background, you know, kind of making sure that we make smaller pieces of it. So, okay, this is good. I don't see any changes you need to make. I think this it feels quite complete and resolved as a design. And what do I mean when I say resolved? It's one of those sort of things that I think in design is we know it when we see it, but it really means people have defined it as meaning that you can't add anything to a design and you can't take anything away, otherwise it will seem like something's not quite right. You know, you can, I think that's like, of course that's not a complete rule. You know, oftentimes in good designs you still can take things away or add things, but you know, you get sort of a general idea that it has a sense of completion to it. Hey, Joseph, yeah, I agree with you. I think there's some really cool elements in here. I like these kinds of insignia elements that you've been creating, almost, you know, where you're building units in the design and, you know, working with positive and negative space. So, yeah, I think it looks really good. And so what I would say that, what I would suggest doing is experimenting now with pulling things off the edge of the page. You know, one thing I was thinking about is how you could maybe take maybe a like kind of like take one of these guys or one of these guys, both of them, and you could repeat them and sort of scatter them through the design and pull them off the edge of the page. You know, more like kind of like a loose pattern, and pull them off the edge of the page. And then also what that would do too is break up a little bit more of the background space. You know, so, you know, keep breaking that up, pulling things off the edge of the page. I think you're, you know, getting very close to this being complete. So yeah, keep experimenting and yeah, maybe keep building on this unit. Once I find in design, like once you've developed a really interesting module, you know, a lot of overlapping shapes that kind of create its own shape, you can kind of use that as a unit, like you can just grab the whole thing and copy it, paste it somewhere else. You could make it bigger, smaller, or leave it the same size, but can, you know, kind of play with it. All right, yeah. So keep going with this, Heather. Thanks so much for you know, working on catching up. I know that you got into the class a little late, so I really appreciate how you're now able to be with us in the group critique. It's always good to be, you know, as everybody, you've probably noticed, I do not take points off for late work. But it means if you're late, it means that you can miss the group critique, which I think is so important for this class. And for any design class, is to just participate in the group critique and see what everyone's working on. And it just gives you a sense, it's, you know, a traditional way of working in design, and getting that kind of feedback as a group is really, really useful. Okay, yeah, I think this is looking really good too. I love the kind of, you're also working with this kind of sense of repeating kind of a pattern, which I think is a great way to develop a design in here and here. And you're also pulling things off the edge of the page, which is great. And so I would just, you know, keep going into this, maybe a little bit more into this space and into this space to break up that background a little bit more, the negative space back there. You could do what I mentioned to Joey previously, is you could use any of the parts that you've already developed, like these stripes or even the whole unit. You can just copy and paste it in here and kind of have it repeating off to the side, you know, like a pattern. That can be a great way to, or you can just sort of continue with the dots, or, you know, build upon what you've already built in here. You know, you can take the whole thing or parts of it and copy and paste it into the design. You know, maybe again, like sort of overlapping on this side as well, you know, filling that space a little bit more. Yeah, so yeah, keep going. You're going in a great direction. Okay, Ebony, a better understanding of positive and negative space. Excellent. That's really one of the keys to this assignment. And you just sort of started off by playing around with the placement. That's really a great way to work with this assignment. And you resized them and rotated. Yes, you can definitely do that. And your focal point ended up being the last thing that I created. Okay, good. Yeah, and your perfectionist ways, yeah, it always does. Yeah. Okay, yeah. You know, I mean, I think that this assignment is really interesting because you can develop it very organically. Sometimes as designers, we end up with a brief or, you know, a concept from our client where we have to just work more kind of with a more of a goal in mind. But this assignment, you know, as long as you followed the criteria, which you did, you could really just experiment and kind of almost in a way puzzle piece it together. Like you kind of build something and go, well, I think that needs something there, and let's like kind of branch off here, and sort of almost like just sort of, yeah, putting pieces together. So this looks really good, and I love, the background, all of these different elements here, the kind of the way you worked with the lines and sort of fit those together. You've done some wonderful overlapping, and going to the edge of the page. I would say, so it looks like, to me, it looks like these little pieces in here, maybe, I don't know what you think about it, but it feels like almost like they're unnecessary, that you have this sort of beautiful larger structure in the background, which seems to kind of carry the design really quite nicely. And it seems like almost in a way that these are covering up all of the beautiful shapes, like the positive and negative shapes in the background. So I would be inclined to take these, just to take those out, see what you have. I think I think your design will definitely be strong enough to work without them. This is something I run into all the time with my design work, and I've noticed, I think a lot of people are the same, where, you start off with a lot of ideas, a lot of different directions in a design, and that's your first draft, or where, that's the first part of your process. And then as you go through, you start going, hey, what do I need everything? Because I find that I'm often removing things in my designs rather than adding extra things as I continue to work on it. It's like, again, it's like I have all these great ideas. Maybe they could be great ideas for more than one design. Like you could take this kind of idea and maybe move it to some other design, if that makes sense. Okay, well, those are my thoughts, and part of working with a group, a critique, is deciding for yourself what makes sense to you, and kind of, I don't know if I said this in the previous critique. I feel like maybe I just said this recently, but if so, you can tune me out. But for me, a group critique is about acknowledging maybe some areas that maybe I already kind of knew, like that intuitively I understood that maybe that wasn't working, and you always, maybe have your own solution for fixing it, but for me, it's always just about getting. I think I did say that in the previous critique. Anyhow, all right, keep going, and yeah, good job. Hi, Mark. Yes, I totally agree with you that the design potential is just, unlimited when you're working with basic shapes. The way they are, you can put them together, and especially when you start working with positive and negative space, and how that kind of can flip your eye a little bit, in a design. In some places the white could be positive, in some places maybe the black is positive, and that's also very interesting. I find that visually very interesting. Yeah, so this is looking really good. I love what you've been doing here with these patterns as well, like other folks have been working with, and also overlapping. I think that, yeah, overall, I think this looks really good. I might maybe just suggest doing a little tiny bit of overlapping in the bottom, wherever you want, like whether it's continuing this guy, or continuing your dots, or moving your dots just to overlap a little bit, kind of touch and overlap. Just because for some reason it feels like maybe the top is where you have a lot of overlapping over the edge, and it seems like maybe it's a slightly bit of like a kind of a different design, the top and the bottom. That can happen, in designs where, different parts kind of feel like they don't quite belong. But I think just overlapping, doing the same sort of strategy of overlapping over this edge a little bit, will give you that sense of cohesiveness. Yeah, looking really good, and that's really the only suggestion I have here. I think you really have done a very nice job with working with the parameters of this assignment, and experimenting with the possibilities. Hi, Tracy. Well, yeah, well, that was wonderful that you had a friend who has Illustrator and you were able to head over there and do that. Thank you for doing that. That's really great. Not all of us have friends who have Illustrator. I don't know if I do, not in the local area. But yeah, hopefully your issue with Adobe will be resolved and you can work at home. But in any case, yeah, okay, this looks really good. You've got some really interesting ways of that you have worked with the space, and yeah, pyramids and all of these interesting sort of shapes within shapes. So what I would just maybe suggest is just pulling things off the edge of the page a little bit more. You're kind of moving right up to that edge. You want to overlap things. An easy way to do that, and I can't maybe I can, let's see if I can pull this into a different software. So I'm just pulled this into Photoshop, so because I can sort of just use maybe the crop tool here, but you can kind of take and sort of like almost like decide where you want your design to end. Like you can kind of just take the design you have, you know. I don't know, I'm not really thinking too much about placement, but you can see just by, you could take all of your shapes and make it a little bigger, like just enlarge them past your frame, and automatically all of these would be cropped, you know? So it would be very easy to take this existing design and just make sure that it meets our requirements of cropping over. And it's also fun too, you can sort of experiment with where that will end. I found that really an interesting, something I used to do more of, where I would take and make a big painting. Sometimes what I would do is just have, for fun, I would cut out different parts of the canvas, you know, and kind of frame it. It was sort of like a compositional exercise, like maybe I would like this little centerpiece here, or like a little part in the corner, and that would, you know, I'd frame that by just cutting it out. Should start doing that again. In any case, so you could try giving that a shot with what you have. I think that's the only thing you really need to do here. And of course, if you want to experiment a little bit more, you know, we're not studying symmetry this week. We're studying it next week. But once you get to, you might want to kind of check in with what we're doing next week with asymmetry or symmetry, because yours is almost symmetrical, where it starts mirroring, you know, like where the left and the right side match. So you could maybe, even if you wanted to, start making it match a little bit more, you know, or not. You could check that out. But by doing that, what you would do is you would just take, for example, this white circle, and then you would move it into the same position as this circle here, you know. That would start making it symmetrical. You notice I haven't really been talking about focal point in the designs. It's because everybody's had a focal point, so I haven't really, and naturally almost always focal points exist in a design, so I don't tend to talk about them very much in this assignment. I should, but you know, you can on your own, looking at everyone's assignment, take a look at where does your eye naturally go first. You know, that is generally the focal point. Like automatically my eye is starting to, you know, go right to here. Now we don't always have the same focal points in terms of what we see in a design, because everybody does see a little bit differently. But in general, you know, the idea of creating, like the intention to create a focal point, is something that a lot of times artists and designers do, because they want that focal point to tell maybe a certain part of the story of a design or an artwork. You know, so it's like maybe the first signpost. In any case, yeah, I just wanted to mention that I have been seeing focal points with everyone's work. So Velvet, yeah, I like what you're doing here too. There's some really nice kind of elements in here. I like this whole sort of central element and the way the eye moves up here. I also like this repetition of the lines down here. It's really nice. So I would say overall this is feeling almost complete. I'm this little curve here, I feel like it's just maybe a little bit of a distraction. I'd almost be inclined to just take that out or replace it with some more of these white bars, which I think are very nice. And then it feels like this little area here doesn't quite seem to work either, right in here. I'd almost be inclined to bring these little kind of, maybe these white sort of circles, kind of have them floating up maybe a bit, or maybe have some more white bars going through here, but it feels like this doesn't quite belong yet with the rest of the design. But yeah, otherwise I think everything, I love what you're doing here with pulling things off. You've got all of the sides cropped, you know, what we call cropped, meaning just pulling things off the edge. So I think you're almost there. Just keep experimenting a little bit more with those areas. My Lord, yes. You know, you mentioned something very interesting in your comment, which is that you started placing shapes around just to kind of get a feel, you know, kind of just sort of experimenting, but then you had to remind yourself that design is done on purpose, not accident. You know, that's interesting, because I do think it's kind of, in a way, a bit of a combination sometimes, but by purpose, I think it's sometimes good to sort of see, like, notice, especially in these kind of projects where we don't necessarily have like a specific goal in mind, you know, like we're not, you know, we're just experimenting with design elements and principles. But noticing that when you have something happening, like in your design, I'm noticing like a lot of these interesting angles, you know, right through here. And then at the secondary element, you've got a circle, but it's like kind of a lot of these angles that are building in here. And when you notice something like that happening in your design, then you can be more purposeful and repeat those things. And that can create a really beautiful design by repeating sort of the same strategy of, a certain angle or a certain little pattern, that kind of brings it all together. So I like that. I would just say maybe just kind of it feels like maybe this little spot in here, this negative space, is maybe a little too open. I'd almost be inclined to maybe repeat some of these stripes in there a little bit, just to break that up a little bit. And then maybe too, this circle here feels a little bit light, like in the sense that maybe it needs a little more visual weight in this area. Like, so maybe you could do something with that circle, make it a little thicker, or build some stripes in there or dots in there, those two areas to kind of just feel a little bit more, but kind of keeping in mind, like keeping that the purpose that you have, like the kind of direction you're going with these angles and circles and stripes. Yeah, just keep going. I think it's really going in a good direction. Okay, Dan, I'm just going to chop off this little bit here, so that we can see your design a little bit better. Yeah, you've got some really interesting elements in here too. Sort of like almost like a sort of circular quality to it, with all of these elements sort of scattered throughout. Yeah, I think that's a really nice idea. Um, so I would say in your design, maybe to kind of pull in a little bit more of the negative space. It feels like there's a lot of this negative space in, and your positive space is a little bit, by comparison, is a little light. So things like, what can you do? Just make things a little bit bigger, like maybe make this element a little bit bigger. I love this circle element. Maybe make it a little bit bigger. Maybe you could have more of these kind of filling the space. Just kind of keep playing with it just a little bit more, experimenting with it. This little motif here that you have going on with the circles, with kind of the little bits, the circle, like kind of like the circles taken out of it, I think is a really wonderful motif. So I'd be inclined to play with that a little bit more, make them a little bit bigger. I'm not 100% sure about the squares in the center. I feel like they don't quite belong to your design. It feels like this whole area in here feels like maybe it isn't really a part of it. So I'd maybe focus on these circle ideas, as well as maybe these sort of rotating bars, and see where you go with that. So keep experimenting a little bit more. I feel like you're getting very close to a solution, um, in terms of like making it all kind of gel together. Hey, Brian, yeah, I love the idea of an implosion, of having everything sort of maybe come to the center. That's an interesting idea. And yeah, I think there's and that definitely creates a strong focal point. And so it looks like you're working with some different shapes here and creating lines of the shapes. And so I would probably suggest what I mentioned to somebody earlier, which is to make sure to pull everything off the page a little bit more. Maybe you could kind of like just make everything a little larger so it crops off. I'm sort of tracing a sort of a possible edge here of your frame, so that instead of just touching the edge, it comes over a little bit more. And then maybe just filling in the space even a little bit more. You've still got a little bit of like negatives, like areas of negative space. See if you can maybe break that up a little bit. Maybe you could just do a little kind of little patterns of shapes, repeating shapes, or repeating what you have. Kind of keep breaking things up a little bit more. Yeah, just keep experimenting. Oh, eyes burning. Yes, I can really relate to that. You get very caught up in design, can't you? Yeah, yes. These are really interesting elements. It's like a very sort of deep design where you can kind of go into all of these different sort of parts, which I think is really, really nice. So yeah, you've got some wonderful overlapping, which I think really is really great. And I like the sort of the play between big shapes and smaller shapes. That's often what we call contrast, where you have something bigger against something smaller. So I would just, I feel like maybe these little dots in here that are floating through the background here aren't quite kind of visually connected. I think they really connect, these dots really connect when they're on a sort of a shape, like these types of shapes, whereas they don't seem to connect floating through the large negative background space. So I might just kind of take them out for now, and then maybe, I don't know, maybe just sort of like build your structure. You've got this wonderful structure happening here with these rectilinear, like, these like kind of white, structure in here. So maybe build a little bit more of the background and then add some dots on top of that. if that makes sense. Just to kind of like visually connect them. Um, yeah, I would say that's the main thing. Maybe this triangle also feels like it's a little bit like disconnected from the design. So sometimes it's good to, you can take things out that don't seem like they quite fit. Maybe take this little rectangle here and sort of, it feels like it almost wants to be joined up with this element, or maybe pulled a little further, this little kind of rectangle here, a little more space or a little bit less space. So keep experimenting. I think like there's some like this little element in here looks really great. In here it looks really interesting. All of these different shapes in here, they're sort of all kind of combining through here. So maybe just kind of experiment with throughout this, maybe this area feels like maybe just more experimentation. And with experimentation, a lot of times it's just, again, finding the strategy that you've been working with. Like maybe it's the circle within the circle, and then you just take that and you repeat that a little bit more. Or maybe it's like these kind of interesting stripes with dot patterns that you suddenly, use in a different place. Using what you have to kind of keep repeating and building. Okay, I think that is it, everybody. Really, I think very impressed with everyone's work. Um, and I'll look forward to seeing what you end up with in the final submission, which is due at the end of this week on Wednesday.